say that if you had stayed in office that you would not have allowed the Shah to fall?
I would not have, no. I would have been steadfast throughout. I would have made it very clear down through the bureaucracy that there was to be absolutely no contact with those that were trying to overthrow him. I would have had a very good study made of Khomeini's background and would have found that exactly what kind of person he was, because by studying his background, they could have known that he was going to do exactly what he's going to do. The man is a radical reactionary. He's not a progressive in any sense of the word.
If you had been...
See, the choice basically was not between the Shah and somebody better. The choice was between him and somebody worse. And it's very easy for me to make that choice.
If you had been confronted with the worst case from that point of view, and the Shah had been overthrown and hostages taken, and you were president, would you have taken him into the United States?
Absolutely. I would have taken him into the United States, and as far as the hostages was concerned, I would have handled that a little differently too. I don't say this in criticism of President Carter, because he certainly went through a lot on the hostage situation. He believes it may have cost him the election. I don't think it did. I think the economic issues were the major ones. But be that as it may, it didn't help him. But as far as the hostage situation was concerned, American foreign policy can never be made hostage to hostages. That's why hostages are taken, for purposes of blackmail. And we mustn't let that happen. And for example, when President Carter was asked about the hostage situation, he went overboard in saying that our first and then only concern was the safety of the hostages. Now, that is a concern, but our major concern is what happens to Iran, what happens to the relations between the United States and Iran. And in this respect, I would never have said, as President Carter did, that I rule out the use of force in order to get the hostages back. All that did was to encourage those that had captured them and were holding them in captivity not to give them up.
That was President Nixon talking to Frank Gannon in May 1983. Good evening and welcome. I'm Mary Kissel with Stevens Inc., your host and fellow panelist for tonight's Nixon Seminar on conservative realism and national security. We are honored to have Ambassador Robert O'Brien and Secretary Mike Pompeo again back co-chairing this discussion with our outstanding seminar members. Tonight, we're returning to a subject that we discussed back in April, Iran, except this time the circumstances are very different. The death of a young Iranian woman, Mahsa Amini, in custody has sparked weeks of protests. The senior Biden administration official says the Iran nuclear deal talks are effectively dead for now, and Saudi Arabia, just in these last hours, has warned the United States of imminent Iran-backed attacks, possibly on U.S. troops in Iraq and in Saudi Arabia. So there's much to discuss. Secretary Pompeo, I'm going to start with you. Give us a sense of how far we've traveled here since April. How different is this environment within Iran today versus back then?
Well, Mary, it's hard to know, I think. These protests are serious. They are broad. They are compared to other levels of other times that there have been protests, even the protests that occurred while we were in office, but especially those back from 2009. They are deeper and more broad-based. They have been sustained for an extended period of time. The regime has pushed back. They've had leaders say this will be the last day of riots. It turned out it wasn't. So some level of progress has been made, but we should, of course, never underestimate the regime and its capacity to inflict enormous burdens on those people, to beat them. The Basij, the IRGC, the local law enforcement officials, I am confident, are determined to maintain the regime's supremacy. But so that's the inside story. The outside story is we've seen a relatively weak support from the United States of America. Even while the protests were going on for a period of time, we continued the United States to negotiate through the Russians with the Iranians to give them a clear pathway to a nuclear weapon, and perhaps just as importantly, give them a whole bunch of money to continue to inflict tyranny on their own people and terror across the world. But I think now the whole world can see even more clearly than they could see in 1979 or 2009. They can see today the nature of this regime. And I pray that these protesters will be safe, that they will continue to demand the simple things that they are asking for, and that this regime will change, will come to understand that their religious zealotry, their kleptocratic nature doesn't work for the noble Iranian people. And I pray that when we do this a year from now, we will see a fundamentally different government in Iran.
Ambassador O'Brien, just building on what Secretary Pompeo said, he referenced the nature of the regime. For those viewers out there that have been getting nothing but coverage of Ukraine and China of late, maybe don't pay so much attention to Iran. What is the nature of this regime? Why is it so critical that we pay attention to those brave people out on the streets?
Well, that's a great question, Mary. The regime is powerful, it's cruel, and it's lost all legitimacy. These protests are enduring. They're indigenous to the Iranian people. They're not stoked by anyone outside. Under normal circumstances, Masha Amini would be given the Nobel Prize posthumously. Women's groups should be flocking to her. What amazes me is that people that here in America claim, and even folks in the administration who claim to be concerned about women's rights, who claim to be concerned about human rights, another word for LGBT rights, they're literally watching gays and lesbians being thrown off buildings and hung from cranes, and women being killed because they don't want to wear a hijab. I mean, and yet you're hearing nothing of no sense of outrage. Other than Iranian expats, no women's groups taking to the streets about this. It's pretty shocking. And look, we need to do a couple of things with the protests immediately to undermine the regime, but to help the Iranian people. They communicate via the internet, and the Iranians are putting up firewalls and blocking apps and that sort of thing. We can take those down, and we should. We should get them Starlink, uplink facilities like we did the Ukrainians, and get those in covertly through our allies, so that these protesters can communicate with each other, so they can let each other know when the secret police that Mike referenced and the Revolutionary Guard are coming, and they can warn each other. So that there are things we can do on that front. But I want to go back and talk about the regime just for a moment, and then I'll finish up. This is a regime that right now is sending these kamikaze drones to Russia to rain down on the people of Ukraine. And again, the administration and so many of our Democrat friends are so concerned about what's happening in Ukraine, but Ukraine is going dark, at night. They don't have electricity because these Iranian drones are taking out electrical substations. And yet that seems to be okay. Everything the Russians do is bad, but if the Iranians supply and train the Russians with their drones, that can't be talked about. The attacks on American allies in Iraq. I mean, think of all the blood and treasure we spent in Iraq, and all the help that we tried to give our friends and our allies, the Kurds and others in Iraq. They're being attacked every day at will by the Iranians without response. There have been threats to senior U.S. government officials and credible threats to attack them on our home soil. And people said that can't happen here. Well, then we saw what happened to Salman Rushdie, who was brutally attacked and stabbed 14 times, lost an eye, and may have lost an arm as a result of it. And now this regime is threatening our allies in Saudi Arabia. And at a time of a significant oil crisis in the world, because America gave up its energy independence, the Saudis are under the threat of an attack on the refineries. These same drones that have taken out vast infrastructure in Ukraine, the Iranians are threatening to send those very same drones to oil refineries in Saudi Arabia. How is that going to affect the world economy? And yet, while all this is going on, we're using the Russians and trying like heck, and even though they said today it probably won't happen, we're trying like heck to get that JCPOA back in place. The JCPOA will do nothing other than give the Iranians money and allow them to become a legitimate nuclear power in 2 to 3 years. It's the craziest thing you've ever seen. I mean, the fact that we're maybe not at war with the Russians, but certainly adverse to the Russians, but we're using their ambassador in Vienna to negotiate with their ally, the Iranians, on our behalf. I mean, who thought that was a good idea, and under what circumstances? And so, but there's this weird religion about the JCPOA. It was the only foreign policy accomplishment of the Obama administration. A lot of those same folks are back, and they want to get it back. I don't know if it's a gift to former President Obama or not, or why they're doing this. It makes no sense. It doesn't make geopolitical sense. It doesn't, it doesn't advance U.S. interests at all. And now we're pushing Saudi Arabia away. So, look, there have been certain areas in the Biden foreign policy where both Mike and I have said, Secretary Pompeo and I have said, there's a level of continuity between the policies we put in place. Maybe they're not going far enough in China, but they're keeping a lot of our policies in place. One place they aren't is Iran. They've got it 100% wrong. Richard Nixon was 100% right in that clip that you played. That was terrific. And when he talked about how Jimmy Carter handled both the Shah and the hostages, he was directly on point. And I'll just finish with one thing. I worked closely with Secretary Pompeo, as you know, Mary, bringing American hostages home. And Mike got more hostages home than I did. He started a little early at the CIA than I started at the State Department. He got a few people out when he was at the CIA and got more out when he was Secretary of State working, and I had the privilege of working with him on that. We never gave in to blackmail. We got our hostages home because we had a policy of peace through strength. And they understood that the detriment that the potential consequences they'd face from holding American hostages was far worse than any leverage they'd attempt to gain over us. So Richard Nixon was right. Secretary Pompeo was right in how we handle those policies. And yet the Iranians still today hold American hostages. Right? So all in all, long answer to your question.
Yeah.
This is a C- or a D for the administration on how they're dealing with Iran. And I think we realize that, as far as short-term threats to the United States, Iran tops the list.
Yeah, I think the answer I was looking for was it's a revolutionary Islamist regime that you can't really negotiate. You can't really negotiate with them, and they threaten the Iranian people. They threaten their neighbors. You said that very, very well. Alex Wong, jump in here, please. Former State Department official.
Great. Thanks, Mary. I just want to pick up on something that Robert had mentioned. I mean, there are some areas where there is some continuity, as Robert said, between the Trump administration and the Biden administration. Obviously, Iran is not one of those. They are highly divergent in a return to, as Robert had explained, this pursuit of the JCPOA. The reason for that, and we have to be clear on this, is there's a fundamental strategic difference in how the Biden administration views Iran, rather than as a source of instability, rather than as the number one state sponsor of terrorism around the world, rather than as a country that is revisionist in its outlook on world order. The Biden administration wants to go back to the Obama philosophy that they need to bring Iran into the region as a partner, as a stabilizing force through the JCPOA. Now, I hope this moment is a wake-up call. I think there have been many others before this, but I hope this moment of protest is a wake-up call that even if the Biden administration wished to rely on Iran as a stabilizing factor in the region, that its own internal instability makes it unsuitable for that. And there has been some talk, or at least some off-the-record remarks or on-background remarks about the administration thinking back to the 2009 Green Movement and the mistake of the Obama administration in not speaking up. And in fact, the then president, explicitly saying they didn't want to meddle in the Iranian protests at that time. So they're thinking about that moment. And I hope it's not simply because they don't want to be politically vulnerable on this point. I hope that it is a true strategic rethink of the suitability of Iran as a quote unquote partner, and a rethink to recognize them for what they are, which is a revisionist power, an adversary that has made its partnerships with other revisionist powers in the world and are moving against our interests, not just in the Middle East, but globally.
Yeah, not all undemocratic regimes are the same. We have to differentiate between the nature of these regimes. Alex Gray, please, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Mary. And your last point about differentiating between the types of regimes we're talking about, that's really the key here. And one of the major failures of this administration has been the inability to make logical distinctions between the regimes that we're dealing with. I go back to my fellow Oklahoman, Jean Kirkpatrick's democracies and dictatorships and double standards from 40 plus years ago. And she was very prescient then, and it holds true now. We have to be making a distinction between systems of government that we may not agree with, but where the interests converge, Saudi Arabia is obviously a great example of that. President Biden said he wanted to make them a pariah state. He's done everything he can to alienate them and to push them not just out of our corner, but into China's corner. And he's done this across the world. And by failing to make logical, practical, statesman-like distinctions between regimes and human rights and our interests, they've weakened us. And the Iran example is I think, one of the more prominent examples of that, but it's by no means the only one.
Well, that clip that we played from President Nixon makes that very clear. He saw Khamenei for who he was, the worst choice out of two sets of bad choices. Congressman Waltz, thanks for coming on tonight. We know your time is short. You're up on Capitol Hill. Is there bipartisanship here? Is there a difference between how the political figures and up there view the situation versus the folks in the White House or on the National Security Council?
Yeah, Mary, there is bipartisanship, but I fear it's diminishing, to be candid. Last year, I did lead a letter to Secretary Blinken and President Biden. And, there's a lot of letters that come out of Capitol Hill, but this one was notable in that 70 Democrats signed on with 70 Republicans saying any future deal had to be broader, to include hostage taking, the other elements of a nuclear weapon, the ballistic missile program, the weaponization, and the inspection regime had to be far deeper. 70 Democrats that signed on. I think that is significant. And you heard some real concerns as the JCPOA just in the recent months seemed to be on the brink of being signed before these protests and before, frankly, the regime, I think, kept moving the goalposts. They know with this administration that if they just ask for a little bit more, that this administration will probably concede a little bit more. Where I fear it's diminishing, though, is we're just hearing more and more of an outcry from the progressive left, particularly not so much around Iran, but around Israel, and some incredibly dangerous language around Israel, terms like an apartheid state and the oppressive government there, really turning their back on the longstanding alliance or our partnership there. And I fear that voice is only going to grow louder as the progressives take more and more, I think, frankly, control of the agenda of the Democrats. I just want to state a couple of things just from some recent meetings that I had. And then I think Ambassador O'Brien's absolutely right in calling out the radio silence that we're hearing on the oppression of women. Just to be very blunt, I think this administration has the worst record on women's rights of any modern administration. When you add in what's happening with Afghan women and girls since that withdrawal debacle, what's happening in Iran today, what is happening to Uyghur women, that the administration agrees with Secretary Pompeo, that are being brutalized, raped, tortured, and put into and forced sterilization campaigns. And then on our southern border, where 40% of women are raped or sold into trafficking as they go through that migration. It's a horrific record. And then the other piece is, our other friends in the region that I don't think are getting the attention and in the relationship that they deserve are the Kurds. I'm co-chair of the Kurdish caucus. I just met with the head of the Iranian Kurdish party while he was in Washington. He couldn't get a single meeting at the State Department, not even an action officer, not single State Department is not meeting with any of the Iranian opposition groups because of this ideology, this religion of the Iran deal. And one wonders, when historians look back on us, why we're not prepared when a regime implodes from within, and we have zero relationships with anyone who then comes to power. And these folks are practically begging for one with us, or in line with our interests and our values. And the Iraqi Kurds, final point, Iraq is sliding into the regime's hands. We have a very hands-off approach there. We have American oil and gas interests. By the way, instead of going on bended knee to Iran or Maduro for more oil on the global market, the Kurds are absolutely wanting and willing to work with us, but American oil and gas firms are being pushed out by the Iraqi government in favor of Chinese and Russian under Iran's influence. So, I mean, it's just the catastrophe and the ripple effects from this administration's flawed approach is touching so many of our friends and affecting so many women around the world.
Yeah, and you're right. We don't hear much about it. For instance, the Wall Street Journal recently reported that since 2015, there have been almost 1,000 Iran-backed drone attacks in Yemen, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Oman, and of course, as Ambassador O'Brien has said, Ukraine. So they're not just oppressing their own people, threatening the elimination and destruction of Israel. They're threatening to kill Americans.
Mary, if I could just jump in one more thing, I think this will be near and dear to Ambassador O'Brien and Pompeo's heart that Senator Ernst and I are pushing legislation. We hope to get it in the defense bill to force the administration to certify that no American officials are under any type of current threat from the Iranian regime before they can release any more money or lift any statutory sanctions. And we're also looking to make President Trump's executive order, the sanctions that he put in place, to make those statutory so that the administration has to come to Congress before they enter any type of new deal.
Yeah, thank you, Congressman. We should have said that because viewers out there may not know that Secretary Pompeo, our former Iran envoy, Brian Hook, and others are under very serious threat from Iran, even here in the United States. Kim Reed, you raised your hand. So we've outlined the threat and the fact that this is a very different regime, but we've also got the Iranian people very courageously standing up. We have Germany and the EU who may sanction the IRGC as a terrorist organization. We have some bipartisanship on Capitol Hill. Should we be a little more optimistic here? I mean, what else can we point to, or is this just all a terrible situation and nothing to be done?
Well, I think it's a wonderful sign that you see these protests in Iran. And I pray for the safety of everyone. And I feel that the regime is feeling threatened. And that's why we're seeing, as you mentioned today, breaking news in the Wall Street Journal on Saudi Arabia. As a woman, and noting that President Biden signed again into law, reauthorized the Violence Against Women's Act. It's now a 3-decade-old law. And so that just happened in March. And as he created, when he came into office, the White House Gender Policy Council, which I quote, has an ambitious agenda to support women and families through domestic and foreign policy. I just want to say what are we hearing and what are we seeing? And I don't think that we're seeing enough. And they're watching closely. And I just want to commend Secretary Pompeo and Ambassador O'Brien and so many of us here who worked on the Abraham Accords. And I really think that we need to build up the Arab-Israeli alliance and our allies, and also that we need to double down on sanctions. But I really want to hear all the women that we've heard so much of recently be focused on this horrific situation. And I know that our voters will speak loudly on next Tuesday about this.
So thanks, Kim. Great to mention the Abraham Accords. Monica Crowley, we do have the prospect of another Netanyahu leadership potentially in Israel. Richard Nixon showed such great strategic foresight when he saw the opportunity to help defend Israel and negotiate agreements with their enemies. I mean, what can we learn from both how President Nixon understood this regime? Because let's face it, it's the same essential regime. And is there anything we can take away from his approach?
Well, thank you, Mary. It's great to be with everyone again tonight. And before we address that part of the question, I just want to say I want to echo the absolute appalling, the concern that we all have about the appalling silence on the women's issue. It would be nice if we saw the Me Too movement rise in defense of these Iranian women, and it's been outrageous that we haven't seen it. Look, I think from a broader strategic angle, from 1979 on, the United States, from a policy perspective as well as a public perspective, we have claimed that we've been waiting for these kinds of moments, right? So in 2009 with the Green Movement and that open revolt, at that point, we had been waiting 30 years for that moment, and yet President Obama and his Vice President, Joe Biden, chose not to lift a finger, not even to offer a word of moral support for the Iranian people. And now here we are several years later, and now it's 40 years that we've been waiting for this moment. And now we have Joe Biden's successor, or Obama's successor, Joe Biden, doing the same exact thing, and all in the name of this pursuit of this disastrous nuclear deal. From a strategic angle, look, I think we are hamstrung by this administration. I don't think they're going to get off their pursuit of this. But I think that the dynamics in the region have changed so much thanks to President Trump's leadership, Secretary Pompeo, Secretary Mnuchin, Ambassador O'Brien, Jared Kushner, all who realigned the strategic dynamics in such a way that you've got a lot of economic and strategic integration in the region now that is going to be irreversible, that is serving as a containment policy in and of itself with regard to Iran. But then again, there's no substitute for American power as well. You talk about Bibi possibly coming back. Yeah, I mean, Israel is facing an existential threat from a possible nuclear armed Iran. We all know that. I think we're going to be in an era of comebacks. Maybe Bibi is going to be the first of several we will see across the West. And I do think, look, you've got the geopolitical aspect of this, the geostrategic aspect. You also have the human rights aspect. You know, Democrats traditionally for decades have talked about human rights, and now they're champions of human rights. And yet you've had two now Democratic presidents in Obama and Biden who have tossed human rights to the side with regard to Iran. But there is a critical element to all of this, in addition to all of the strategic aspects we're talking about, which is demographic change in Iran. Over 60% of the Iranian population is under the age of 30. And so obviously change is going to happen in Iran. It's happening right now, with or without support from the United States and the West. And we better be in a position to take advantage of that and speak to those younger people who are pretty soon, sooner rather than later, going to be in the leadership in Iran. So this administration might not be thinking about this, but we have to think carefully that if this current regime collapses, what do we want to see replace it? And cultivating those younger generations to make sure that we, as President Nixon talked about with regard to the fall of the Soviet Union and what kind of successor state in Russia we wanted to see and how we could encourage that optimal successor state, we need to be thinking about that right now, and in terms of encouraging and reaching out to those younger demographics in Iran that will be taking control over the reins of power, probably again sooner rather than later.
Secretary Pompeo, can this regime be contained? Is that possible? Is that what we were trying to do with the maximum pressure campaign, or do we really need to see a free Iran to stabilize that very important region, the Middle East?
Oh, goodness. You know, the capacity, I think you said earlier, Mary, the capacity to negotiate with the Iranians is exactly zero. You'll remember from our time in office, there was a theory that there were Iranian moderates, right? That Zarif and Rouhani were these somehow, if they could just get a little more power, life would be good for the world. That was folly. It was naive. And now they, of course, have left the stage, and the grip has been tightened by the Islamists, by the theocrats. In the end, this will be a change that comes from within. But in the interim, our theory of the case was to deny them the capacity to be troublemakers. That's how a Kansan would think about it when you had a dispute at the boundary of your farm, right? So we were taking away their wealth, their capacity to build their military, their capacity to build the very drones we were speaking of earlier, their ability to cause trouble around the world, right? So this administration has done exactly the opposite of the deeds that we did. If you think, forget the words and the rhetoric for a second. So the first thing these guys did is they walked in and they said, it turns out the Houthis aren't terrorists. Of course, even then, the Houthis were firing missiles into Saudi Arabia every day, something we, of course, not happened to our country.
The Houthis being the rebel group,
the Iranian proxies in Yemen, yeah. So and you could go through the list. They're underwriting the Shia militias in Iraq. The Iranians are. The administration then forces the Israelis to cut a deal on natural gas. I won't get in the middle of whether it was a good deal or a bad deal, but suffice it to say, the administration largely adopted a number of the equities that belong to the Iranian-backed Hezbollah. They sat with the Russians. They undid all of the work we'd done on snapback. They made clear to the Emiratis, the Omanis, the Kuwaitis, the Saudis, they made very clear to them that they were to be second fiddle to the relationship between the United States and Iran. And so all of the focus at the senior level was the negotiations between the United States and the Iranians, and the Saudis were left to be pariahs. Those are the things that people around the world noted. Our theory of the case was very different. We had a friend, a partner in Israel. We moved the embassy, recognized the Golan Heights, made clear that Israel wasn't an occupying nation. I traveled to Judea and Samaria as a Secretary of State. We identified Iran as the problem child, and we isolated Iran. And maybe that is the best one can do. But that isolation gave the opportunity for the Iranian people to have increased space, increased capacity, and built up opportunity for moments just like this one. If the Iranians had a few billion less dollars, if their economy hadn't grown more this year than ours, the probability of success for the Iranian people and human rights and women's rights inside of that country would be far greater than it is today.
Well said. I want to bring in Bridge Colby, who has just written a book on grand strategy, thinks about that at the Marathon Initiative. Bridge, we've heard now several times that because the Iranians have this money that Secretary Pompeo just mentioned, courtesy of the Biden team, that they are able to effectively aid Vladimir Putin, and those regimes are working together. That regime is working with China. As you stand back and you look at the world, how does Iran fit into this nexus? How important are they? And could they tip the balance in a place like Ukraine?
Thanks, Mary. And I think it's funny. Not funny. It's on point, because I was doing something earlier in the day about the potential for simultaneous conflicts and how stressing this is for not just our military, but for our strategy on the whole. And I think, picking up on a theme that a number of the other speakers have emphasized, and Secretary Pompeo was just emphasizing, is the importance of having strong partners and allies. And I think others were saying the same thing. And of course, Israel, our special ally, but also Saudi Arabia, which, despite the fact that it's a different form of government, we don't approve everything they're doing. They're a much better and more natural and established partner of our ally in a lot of ways of ours than many others. And I think having those positions of strength, and that's something that, from my understanding, it was really a signature of President Nixon's approach. But I think, instead of saying, oh, we're going to take care of the Iran problem by, reaching out to them and giving them a bunch of money and hoping for the best and, sort of transforming the nature of our relationship with them, why don't we negotiate if that's appropriate, why don't we approach this problem from a position of strength? And, both with the Saudis, of course, where we're really in a bad place, as far as I can tell. I mean, there was the sort of notorious fist bump, but that seems to have been followed by pretty open sort of undermining of the narrative by the Saudis. There was a long article in the Wall Street Journal basically saying they don't trust us at this point. And I mean, it's not completely incomprehensible. And I mean, some of the points that we were just mentioning about sort of the policy of the administration early on in the Middle East. So I think that's not surprising. And of course, I think we're in a lot of ways we're seeing an increasingly bifurcated world, and it's not surprising at all that the Iranians are supplying the Russians, and it seems to be fairly material. The Russians are using those drones a lot, and we don't know what else is going on. And I would expect the Chinese are going to be doing the same kind of thing. And it's very clear from the Party Congress that the Chinese regard confrontation with the United States and our allies as inevitable and fundamental. And in that kind of situation, if you're China, I mean, you're going to stick with Russia as they are, not because it's a good thing, but because that's your option, and with Iran. And so we should expect these things to go together. And so in those kind of positions, you don't want to sort of toss your strong partners like Israel and Saudi Arabia to the side. You want to bolster them and back them up and give them the ability to help as much as possible.
When we say help as much as possible, I want to go to Ambassador O'Brien. I mean, it's rare to get a former national security advisor one-on-one here to pick your brain. But when we think about tools to help the Iranian people, it often gets boiled down to, well, we're going to sanction the regime, or we're going to go to war with them, or we just talk to them. But it just strikes me that there's an awful lot in between that we can do, that we have many more tools at our disposal. Can you just address that a little bit for the viewers to get a sense of, we talk about diplomacy, or engaging with this, let's be frank, enemy. What can we do? What are the options that the president has?
Well, there are a lot of options, and there's a big gray area between appeasement, which is where we're at now. And I just want to make a point, and Secretary Pompeo will remember this. I was relatively new as the National Security Advisor, and we were at the UN back in 2019. And we wanted to negotiate with the Iranians. We wanted to try and get a good deal on the nukes. The Iranians would not come to the table. We had no preconditions. They wanted us to pay to come to the table to negotiate with them. In other words, they wouldn't negotiate with us unless we made concessions to get them to the table. So they came to the table pretty quickly in the Biden administration. And so obviously massive concessions have already been made to the Iranians just to get them to the table, because that's the Iranian negotiating position. But between the rank appeasement that we're seeing and between all-out war, there's a large gray area. So one thing we ought to be doing is using the tools of national power. And one of our great tools of national power is our tech industry. We can use our private sector tech companies to open up the internet in Iran. There's nothing the Iranians can do about it, and allow their people to have access to the internet. Why aren't we doing that? Why isn't the Biden administration, with their great relationship with the tech companies, encouraging big tech to open up the internet? Why aren't we smuggling? And it's a smuggler's paradise in that part of the world. We could be smuggling in dhows, just like the Iranians smuggle things into the Gulf countries and into Yemen. We could be smuggling uplink facilities for Elon Musk's satellite Starlink, so the Iranian people can communicate with each other. That's one area. The other thing is propaganda, and propaganda's got kind of a bad word, but using our Radio Free Europe assets, using our allies that Mike Waltz, Congressman Waltz, talked about, Iranians who want to change their own country and have routes into Iran. We need to start getting material, whether it's like the old Samizdat, copies of newspapers and that sort of thing, into the Iranians. But we can also use the radio waves and SMSs and texts and all kinds of things to get word into the Iranians.
Robert, we tried to reform the radios during the last administration. They're kind of lost. They're almost unreformable. I mean, is that really an option? I got to push back on you there.
No, but with the right leadership, we could. And then you talk about diplomacy. The Abraham Accords was a massive blow to the Iranians, and we should be adding, instead of pushing Saudi Arabia away and calling them a pariah. They were very close to coming into the Abraham Accords when we left office, when Secretary Pompeo and President Trump and I and Jared and all those who were involved in Secretary Mnuchin who were involved in the Accords. And there were other countries that were talking to us and were serious about it. That would put tremendous pressure on Iran. And then what we could do is we could use sanctions targeted. We could target the sanctions like the Houthis, Secretary Pompeo talked about it. The first thing that the Biden guys did, I can't remember if they removed the sanctions on Putin and Nord Stream 2 or removed the sanctions on the terrorist Houthis first, but it was a mad rush to do both of them. Look, we can sanction Hezbollah. There's a lot we can do with the Lebanese. We give the Lebanese government a lot of money. That government is now basically owned and controlled by Hezbollah. We need to help the Lebanese push back. We need to help our allies in Iraq, push back against the Iranians. We need to help the Kurds, as Congressman Waltz pointed out. So there are economic tools we've got. There's kind of gray area information warfare that we can use. And look, there's something else that's pretty simple. I mean, Ronald Reagan used to talk about winning the Cold War by being the shining city on the hill, by being that beacon of freedom. We're not the shining city on the hill for the Iranian people, because as they go out in the streets and are killed, we just keep asking the Russians to please, please, please get the Ayatollahs and the mullahs back to the table in Vienna so that we can surrender to them. I mean, we're not that beacon of strength. We're not that shining city on the hill. So, look, there's a lot that we can do short of military intervention with Iran directly. And look, we did a lot of that in the Trump administration. The Israelis did a lot, and we had the Iranians on their back heels. And now they're not on their back heels. They're leaning forward and they're punching us with jabs.
I mean, a lot of our seminar members travel around the country, meeting with lots of different communities, including the Iranian American community, which is extremely active. And it's not just the folks who are living here in the United States. So we saw photos from Berlin of thousands of Iranian exiles out on the streets protesting for freedom. I might go over, since you guys aren't raising your hands, I'm going to go over to Alex Wong, who, has dealt with the ins and outs of diplomacy and thought through these issues. Alex, is there a role here for the community in exile? And if so, what can they do? How can we harness their enthusiasm and their personal connections back home?
Well, I think there's certainly a role. I think there might be a general misconception that Iran is a closed-off country, a closed-off society, but in fact, it's quite porous. Their people travel, they do get information, they do understand what's going on in the world. So, and much of that is through the diaspora communities that are around the world. And you've mentioned some of the protests, but getting information that the world is aware of the protest, is supportive, and having diplomatic messages sent, with our like-mindeds, that if there is a moderation of the regime or a change in the regime, that there is a place for a more moderate, non-revisionist Iranian leadership down the future. That could be a great succor to the protests right now. And I don't think we should be shy about voicing our support for the protests in the way that I view the Biden team to be reluctant. Because a part of what we have to understand about the Iranian regime is there is a level of sensitivity to their population. Now, I'm not saying in democratic terms, they're obviously not sensitive in the way that our government is sensitive to the vote. But there is a deal that they have, constructed here, where they give a modicum of some self-determination, or at least a fig leaf of it, in the form of some democratic elections at the local levels and some corrupt national elections. But then a deal of some economics, at least steady state, if not growth, combined with some nationalist sentiments abroad and some glory abroad, and a strong military and a strong internal security service. All of those work in concert to keep the regime in power. Now, when those kind of stilts of the regime start moving out, whether the economic situation is awry, whether the corruption of elections, which you've seen multiple times, gets to a point where it's undeniable, or where there start to be fissures in the military, that is something that we should put pressure on. Democratic pressure, internal pressure is a tool for us in our strategy to again, work from a position of strength against the Iranian regime. And those are things we should look at, and the diaspora communities are a part of that. One other point I want to make, just
please,
jump back in.
Please, keep going, yeah.
We pay a lot of attention, not, justifiably, to the upheaval, socially, economically, politically, that has come from the COVID-19 pandemic. we should be aware that a lot of the upheaval we're seeing now, economically, socially, trust in their own regime. The COVID-19 pandemic hit Iran much harder than it hit us in relative terms. So what we're seeing here is upheaval. And we should not be shy about analyzing that upheaval, trying to predict what will happen. But yes, trying to affect it and give our support, whether it's through diaspora communities or other methods, if we can move the regime, move the region to a state that is more amenable to our interests.
Well, Secretary Pompeo, that's kind of a natural segue to you. You ran CIA. Do we engage or in those kinds of activities? Is there kind of a taboo because we got a bad name for doing that over time? Is there a role here? And secondly, while I've got you, are there partners in the region that we don't speak much about? I mean, we hear a lot about, especially on the political right, partnering with Saudi Arabia, but should we be talking about what the Omanis do with us, or, other regimes in the region? Give us kind of an inside look here.
Well, Mary, I can't say a whole lot about the things the CIA is or isn't doing. It is the case that 1953 Mossadegh, CIA's, there are great stories. I can neither confirm nor deny them. But we do have clandestine capabilities. We have quiet capabilities, not just the Central Intelligence Agency, but the clandestine services of our Department of Defense as well. There are many tools that we can work to provide support, and I hope the administration is doing those. We also had a great partner. We had a great partner when I was at CIA with Mossad. We had great relationships with Shin Bet and their internal services. They have a singular focus, so they are very powerful there, right? Their existential threat, America is to the CCP as Israel is to Iran, would get you a decent shot on your SAT test if those were still permitted in America. But they have a real toolkit, and we ought to provide help and assistance to protect not only Israelis but American interests there as well. I'd say one other thought that hasn't been mentioned tonight. When you talk about other tools, I heard President Biden speaking, I think it was yesterday, about a windfall profits tax. I assume he means on the Iranians who are making ungodly money from the sale of their energy because we're not forcing sanctions, and they are now still selling at a discount to the market price, but the global market price is much higher. I assure you the Iranian margins on their crude are higher today than they were at noon on January 20th of 2021. And so when I think of a windfall profits tax, it seems to me that might be the place to put it and produce that energy here. That would actually help the Iranian people an awful lot too. If the Iranian government didn't have access to the sale of their petroleum products around the world, either smuggled or in the open market in ways they couldn't do for the last 20 months of the Trump administration. These are serious tools that could give the Iranian people the opportunities that they need and that they so richly deserve. You should know, Mary, too, we were talking about the diaspora. You were on some of these trips with me. When I would travel in the United States, we would often meet with them, sometimes quietly, sometimes more noisily. We did it in Dallas. We did it in Los Angeles. I think we did it in Chicago. We would go meet with those groups, not because we were picking a winner inside of Iran as for who would be the next set of leaders, but we wanted to know that we were supportive of them and often their families who were still stuck in this terrible place. And I am highly confident that the Biden administration is not meeting with Iranians around America who could be an important voice inside of that country supporting the Iranian uprisings as well.
Bridge, I want to take it.
Mary, can I just jump in for 1 second?
Yes, please.
Following up on Mike's comment. Look, I think the Biden administration ought to send an envoy, a special presidential envoy to Midland, Texas, and to Calgary, Canada, instead of sending them to Venezuela and to Tehran and to Moscow. So let's get an envoy to Midland and see if we can solve this energy crisis.
Well, it raises the question of leverage, right? Where's our real leverage over this regime? And what we haven't talked about are our friends and allies that are buying that oil from Iran. Has India cut them off? Does the French oil company Total still want to do business in Iran? Bridge, you were at the Department of Defense looking at our allied relationships, and we're talking a lot about our enemies. What about our friends? What are they doing for us here?
Well, that's a good question. I'm not tracking it too closely, but obviously, the Indians, for instance, are buying up a lot of Russian gas. So, I think realistically, and the Chancellor of Germany is heading to China right now. So, I think the almighty dollar, or whatever the equivalent is a reality that we're going to have to deal with. But again, as Ambassador O'Brien was just saying, let's get our own energy production so we make it not only something where we have to ask the better angels of the nature of our allies, but it's actually in their pecuniary interest, and we'll have a much more compelling case than as the ambassador was saying, going to the Venezuelans and begging them to up production. So I think that's the best way is to appeal to the self-interest of our allies, especially where they're most aligned, and then we're the most likely to make progress together.
Monica Crowley, jump in.
Yeah, thank you. Listening to this conversation, I just want to make a point about the media and the importance of media coverage of situations like what is happening right now in Iran. When Russia invaded Ukraine, the US media, the Western media, rightfully gave it extensive coverage. Wall-to-wall coverage continues to do so. They created a narrative. They continue to feed that narrative with regard to Russia and Ukraine. But we have these mass protests going on in Iran. And because so much of the media now is propaganda for the Biden administration and for the left, those protests simply don't fit the narrative. So they're not getting coverage. So it's one thing when you have an administration that has a certain set of policy priorities that can drive the media narrative because the president, the administration, the Secretary of State, National Security Advisor, they're all talking about it, forcing the press to cover it. Or you have a situation that is happening that the press is then forced to cover with or without an administration's prioritization of what's happening externally. But in this case, you have this incredible development in Iran, and the press is simply not covering it for a whole variety of reasons. And, I'm not sure what the answer is. I do think the diaspora can put a lot of pressure on elected officials and others to continue to raise this in order to bring pressure to bear on the media to cover it. But I think if you walked into an average street, Peoria, Illinois, and asked an average American, do you know what's going on in Iran right now? They would say no, they have no idea. There is some activity on social media. There are certain groups covering it, but in terms of the mainstream press, they're simply not doing it. And without the press covering it, we're really at a loss for that major weapon that we can bring pressure to bear on the administration and members of Congress to talk about it and advance some of these policy ideas that we're all bringing to this conversation.
Yeah, you never know that Iraq has a new leader in the last couple of weeks. Who's talking about that? Monica, on that, how effective was President Nixon from your experience and your conversations with him about driving that narrative? We heard him at the top explaining very clearly the choice that was before Jimmy Carter, and analyzing it, and a lot of just plain common sense. What did you learn from him and working with him?
Well, look, every president has to do a calculation in terms of risk and reward. And certainly we're facing that calculation right now with Iran. Look, Nixon and Kissinger were both disciples of the concept and the approach to foreign policy, realpolitik, balance of power issues, which they applied to the region very effectively. Henry Kissinger was engaged in constant shuttle diplomacy in the Middle East and trying to advance America's interests and our interests in the region. And here in this administration, you simply have none of that. We've often talked in this group about how President Nixon was a visionary. And we spoke about it at the last event live in person at the Nixon Library. We don't have a visionary leader right now. In fact, we have the antithesis of a visionary leader right now. So all of the policy ideas that we're bandying about now, we are really hamstrung by having a president who doesn't appear to be willing to move in any of those directions. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't be prepared for the eventual transition of power here. But in terms of thinking strategically, the Trump administration, Secretary Pompeo, Ambassador O'Brien, thought extensively about this and executed policies that got us to a very productive place in the region where we were delivering real durable and stable peace and integrating those moving parts in a way that would backstop any kind of backsliding in the region. But now we're faced with a real opportunity in Iran, and there's simply no visionary leadership whatsoever.
I mean, then again, we tend to miss everything. I mean, we missed the fall of the Soviet Union. We missed the Arab Spring. We didn't think the Iranians would have an uprising in 2009. We didn't think that the Cubans would get out onto the streets just a couple of years ago, or the Venezuelans. I mean, we seem to be really lousy at understanding the internal dynamics of critical countries that could really, change the outlook on important parts of the world. Kim Reed, you wanted to jump in. You're on mute.
I just for those who are watching, who support the Nixon Library, we had a great session last month together in person, and we really appreciate your focus on President Nixon. And as we look at the future, I want us to remember who we're focused on today and tell you a little bit about her. So she was 22 years old. We've talked about her, Mahsa Amini, but she was a Kurd. And her Kurdish name was Gina, and she wasn't allowed to use that name. The Iranians would not allow that. And so I just hope going forward, what's Iran going to do? It's going to be up to Generation Z in Iran. And I really hope that we do all we can through conversations like this, because the internet's very powerful. And the Nixon Seminar is one way that we can get these great ideas over there. Also, as the Supreme Leader Khomeini thinks about his legacy, he's 83 years old. We know that he's focused on an economy of resistance. And so going back to your economic question, he's focused on trade with our wonderful non-allies of China and Russia and countries like Afghanistan and Iraq. So I really hope that the Biden administration focuses on how we can get at this from a national security perspective. But I just wanted to take it back, and as we remember Gina in her wonderful life.
Yeah, well, thank you so very much. We're running these conversations. We always seem to run short on time. We've only got 2 minutes left. That's about a minute apiece for our co-chairs. Ambassador O'Brien, any final closing thoughts?
So we've talked a lot about the challenges we're facing and some of the disappointments we're seeing in the current administration. But look, I'm an optimist about America. America remains fundamentally strong. We're the greatest nation on the earth. We can be again. We need new leadership. I think we're going to see new leadership very soon, starting next week in the House and the Senate. And in 2 years from now, we're going to have great leadership again in this country. And when that happens, the American people should remain hopeful. They should remain cheerful, remain optimistic. Freedom, liberty, the rule of law, our way of life is going to prevail. We've got the best men and women in the world in our military, and we're going to prevail against the Iranians, the Russians, the Chinese. But we need new leadership to do it, and I think it's coming. I think that's something we can all have a smile about and hope for as we watch the midterms come in. Bibi's back, and I think others are going to be back as well. So I think there's good news on the horizon, no matter how discouraging some of the news we've talked about today is.
Yeah, I like that upbeat tone. Secretary Pompeo, final thoughts?
So we should end there with that optimism. There are good things to come, and the anchors that were set with the Abraham Accords in the region, I think, will prove lasting. They took American leadership, but they will continue to, because it's good for the people of the region. And when you get that right, when you get enhanced prosperity, less risk, more security, then those nations can continue to confront Iran. And one day we'll be in a place where we can all say, yep, this went well. Good outcomes all around. And the risk to the United States and the fact that the risk that we have to send our young kids to fight in that place again can move even closer to zero than we were able to get it to during our 4 years. I think good things are in store, because in the end, we set the course and set those anchors.
And we have to just commend the courage of these Iranian protesters. How extraordinary to see them out in the streets. And we wish them good luck and success. I want to thank our co-chairs, Ambassador O'Brien and Secretary Pompeo, are really outstanding, very experienced seminar members. They're serious people thinking serious thoughts. Isn't that nice to hear on foreign policy? Please follow them across social media, their podcasts, their TV, and their radio. We don't have a seminar in December, but we have a Nixon Grand Strategy Summit in Washington, November 10th and 11th. It's going to be streamed live on YouTube, and we hope that you'll all follow us there. So thanks to everyone for participating. Thanks to our viewers and listeners. We appreciate you. And we'll hope to see you live on YouTube at the Strategy Summit. Good night.